tried to put a figure out there that was some representation of how worthy someone's life is.
It's a question that is much more difficult than merely guilt or innocence.
We kind of sat there and said, now what?
There are times during our deliberations that the emotional side of all of us came out.
What, for example, is the value of a person's life?
10 million.
$500,000.
Around 5.
How much do you make a doctor pay for a fatal mistake?
To some people, $500,000 was a tremendous amount of money. And to others, we said, I don't think it is.
$100 million wouldn't have done it. You know, there was no number that could compensate that family for the loss of the wife and the mother. There was no way to do it.
Tonight, critical condition, the mind of a jury.
From ABC News. This is Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
This one really does depend on whom you're talking to and where in the country you happen to be. Talk to Dr. Dennis Mollman, for example. He's a St. Louis neurosurgeon, although he won't be for much longer. Last year, his malpractice insurance premium was $64,000, which seemed like a heck of a lot of money to Dr. Mollman until his insurance company told him what his premium would be next year. Are you ready for this? $464,000. Dr. Mollman is closing down his St. Louis practice and moving to either Kansas City, Kansas, where his premium would be $65,000, or Warsaw, Wisconsin, where it would cost a bargain basement $10,000. Oh, to be an insurance company, right? Until they tell you that in 1995, insurers paid out 99.7 cents for every dollar they took in malpractice premiums. These days, the companies are reportedly paying out $1.65 for every dollar they take in, which is not what they teach you in business school either. Well, it must be the plaintiffs' lawyers who are cashing in. Just think of all those multi-million-dollar malpractice awards. Except the lawyers insist that they are losing almost 2/3 of all their malpractice cases. And in most of these cases, when they don't win, they don't get paid. But, what a payday when they do get paid. Who decides those awards anyway? That's up to the jury, isn't it? Which is what brought my Nightline colleague John Donvan to a conversation with several former jurors in a medical malpractice suit.
My name is Sue Mahoney, and I own a restaurant in Center City, Philadelphia called 2021.
My name's Charles Baum. I go by Chip. I'm a truck driver.
My name is Risa Jaffe. I'm an office manager in a dental office.
My name is Linda Bird, and I'm Dean of Women at Northeast Baptist School of Theology in Downingtown.
It's the first jury that I've sat on, and I was the foreman.
This was the second time that I'd actually been on a jury trial.
This was my first jury.
This was my first trial.
4 middle-class Americans joined 8 others in a Pennsylvania courtroom this past July and did their civic duty. It was yet another medical malpractice case in America. The jurors heard both sides. They weighed the evidence. They reached a decision. The defendant to pay the plaintiff $3 million.
$3 million. Nowadays, an award like that doesn't even make headlines. It's the $50 million awards that do, although those are actually quite rare. Nationally, the median award is about $1 million. Still, across the nation, there's a feeling that malpractice awards are spiraling out of control, with the ordinary American citizens who sit on juries making the final decision on the dollar value of pain and suffering and human life.
All we asked our 4 jurors to do was talk us through it, explain how they came up with $3 million. Testimony ends, the lawyers sum it up, the jury goes out to deliberate, and then it turns out, they improvise.
We kind of sat there and said, now what?
We all walked in there and just kind of looked at each other. We had no clue what we really needed to do.
Before we even had a conversation about any of the testimony, we decided, let's just all write a number down on a piece of paper, what we think total damages should be.
My number was initially $5 million.
$500,000.
I was thinking around 5.
I was the high one, 10 million.
So $5 million, where does that number come from?
It was honestly somewhat of a random number.
Why not 50? Why not 1? Why 10?
I don't know.
I don't know. That's just one of those things I don't know. I don't know how you could give that answer.
I guess from my interaction with the group, I felt that if I put down 10 million, I would probably be at the top, and it would give us some range.
We were astounded when we saw how far apart we were.
So they talked. And one of the main things they talked about, obviously, was the case itself. It centered on the death of Dagmar Lackman, a wife and mother of 4 grown children. She had died of breast cancer in 1998. Her family argued that she could have been saved, except that in 1995, this mammogram was misread by a Dr. Norman Hauser, the radiologist who studied it, and missed an early warning sign of cancer. As a result, the family says, she lost critical time in seeking treatment. Dr. Hauser did not contest the accusation of negligence. All the jury needed to decide was how much to make him, or actually his insurance company, pay to the Lackman family.
I had to just decide what would be fair and equitable just to make the right statement to these people, just to be able to help them through with the loss of household help. Isn't that a horrible thing to think of?
In deliberations, many jurors found themselves torn between 2 opposing forces. One of those forces was the Lackman's lawyer, Tom Klein, whose goal, of course, was to get the dollar amount as high as possible.
Under the law, the family was entitled to be compensated. I then showed the jury just how wonderful a woman she was and how wonderful a family they had to consider in reaching their award.
We felt we knew the family, we knew Dagmar, we understood what they went through. He did a very skillful job of painting that picture.
Klein played a videotape Dagmar Lackman made before her death. She spoke of her children, of her dreams for them, of her regrets that she would be leaving so soon.
About the time I started chemotherapy, Ruth had her senior prom. And she looked so lovely, and you wondered if you'd see her in that wedding dress.
What was the impact of that videotape on you?
It was pretty brutal to watch. We were all dreading it.
I think the worst part was when she came on with her tape deposition.
Why?
Because you know you were looking at somebody that wasn't here.
It was an emotional roller coaster. It was gut-wrenching.
Emotion. The judge had cautioned the jurors about that. It is your sworn duty, he told them, to judge this case solely upon the evidence, without sympathy, prejudice, bias, or any other extraneous considerations. Sympathy, however, was undoubtedly flowing in that courtroom.
It's an emotional case. Everybody has a mom, you know, you see yourself in that situation.
Did you feel that the plaintiff's attorney, Tom Klein, was trying to push your emotional buttons?
I thought that he was an excellent attorney, and I think that's part of the game, that you do have to push the emotional buttons.
Did it work?
I think it must have.
For you?
Oh, how can it not? If you were a human being sitting there listening to that, how can it not?
As much as you're supposed to keep emotion out of the picture and any personal experiences or instances that might be similar, it's impossible. Probably the most pertinent scenario for me was my mother had passed away within a year. So I was thinking from the family sense of what would make me feel better.
The juries should not be awarding money based upon emotion.
Mike McGilvery was the doctor's attorney.
Their verdict was influenced by grief, sadness, the skillfulness of Mr. Klein's presentation, and that shouldn't be the way we decide cases.
There were jurors who wept for Dagmar Lackman during that trial, and there were those who looked at her life and tried to connect it to money, and in a certain sense they wanted to put the price tag at infinity.
My thought process was there's no way to do it. That $10 million, when I had that number, would not do it.
Too little? Too much?
It just wasn't enough. $100 million wouldn't have done it. You know, there was no number that could compensate that family for the loss of the wife and the mother. There was no way to do it.
But you still had to come up with a number.
We did, as a jury, we did.
But as a jury, they faced another force that pulled them in the opposite way, back down to earth in a world of dollars and cents.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Sprint.
See Friday.
The jurors were in complete agreement that the family of Dagmar Lackman deserved some compensation for her death, but here comes the hard part. How much? Part 2 of John Donvan's report.
While the jury deliberated damages in the case of Lackman versus Hauser, and some literally did weep over the fate of Mrs. Lackman, something else made at least a few of them uncomfortable. The numbers they were talking about.
A lot of people said that, all right, what's another million? I guess when you talk in those kind of numbers, it's hard for people to comprehend. Another million, okay, 2 million, 3 million, okay, fine.
In fact, it reminded them of stories like these they'd read about in the papers, the verdicts that set records.
You always hear it as like, they hit the lottery. Well, they didn't hit the lottery. They got an emotional jury that said, stick it to them.
And you did not want to be one of those.
None of us want it to be.
Yet we were tossing around millions.
And that seemed like you were up in the stratosphere?
Yes, it was...
Out of oxygen up there?
Almost too much power.
In that jury room, they told us they openly discussed the nation's malpractice insurance crisis, which is particularly acute in Pennsylvania, where doctors have recently gone out to protest high malpractice insurance rates, and some are actually leaving the state altogether. This was all very real to the jurors who had to come up with a number.
I had 3 out of my regular doctors that had told us that they canceled everything but emergency appointments, and told us that they weren't sure if they were going to be there anymore.
How much were you saying we should not add to this crisis with a large figure?
That was a huge part of it.
You discussed it.
Absolutely.
You're letting politics come into it in a way.
Well, it's everywhere, and it affects all of us. You know, if I have a doctor who I feel very comfortable with and is very competent, and next thing you know, he's no longer in the state, well, it affects me personally.
All this was a long way from the facts of the Dagmar Lackman case.
So how did the group finally come up with the amount of $3 million? Part of it, they say, was easy. In Pennsylvania, courtroom lawyers are not allowed to suggest a specific dollar amount for pain and suffering, but they can offer an estimate of a person's economic worth.
Which means, to be exact, a measurement of Lackman's productivity in economic terms over her expected lifespan. An expert was put on the stand to estimate this.
The total economic value for her, or for someone like her, an employed homemaker, is not only the value of her earnings, but also the value of her production in the household. The things that she did around the household that are now lost.
Such as?
Cooking, cleaning. Mrs. Lackman actually performed most of the yard work, and did a number of things.
And you can put a number on that?
Correct.
That number, the expert put it roughly $327,000. The jurors wanted to make sure that amount would be covered. They also wanted to cover the family's next big expense.
If you wanted the family to come out with something so much, you had to take into effect about what the percentage of the lawyers were going to take.
After that, and they all told us they did this, they remembered what the judge had told them about keeping emotions out of it.
Both lawyers told you, and the judge told you, do not let your emotions affect what you're going to do in terms of the dollars. Did you succeed at that? Were you able to put your emotions aside?
I think I was.
Really?
I think I was. If I hadn't, I would not have come in with the numbers that I did.
In the end, they settled on a number that sort of split the difference mathematically, roughly in the middle of the range of numbers most of them started out with. The vote was 11-1.
Did it feel right to you at that point, just because you'd all agreed to it? Were you certain that $3 million was the right number?
Not until we sat down in there.
Meaning what?
Tom Klein looked over and mouthed. He didn't come out and say it. He just said, thank you.
They seemed pleased which
Did that please you?
it did.
Did you think that it was your job to please them?
No, but it was
But you liked
important
pleasing
to me.
them.
Yeah.
I looked at the family, and I really thought that they were satisfied, and I was surprised. I was still feeling that they were probably looking for more than $3 million. I didn't want them to feel bad.
And yet, this juror was the one who voted no on $3 million as a figure too high.
I felt very bad at being the one.
The holdout.
The holdout.
Why did you feel bad about that?
Because I didn't want a message to go that I didn't feel like this family deserved it. What were they thinking? Were they thinking that I thought they deserved nothing? I wanted to say, no, I voted no because it's a number. But my heart is broken for your loss.
A complicated legal process brought to a conclusion by legal amateurs, which is the premise of the American jury system. Actually, the case isn't quite over. The defense is appealing the $3 million as too large, arguing that it, quote, shocks the conscience of the court. That one, it will be up to the trial judge to decide, and he is a professional in these matters. I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Norristown, Pennsylvania.
So, is there a fair way to resolve the conflict between the compensation for a patient wronged and the price doctors have to pay for their mistakes? That conversation when we come back. Ken Thorpe is the chairman of the Department of Health Policy and Management at Emory University. He's made a specialty of studying health insurance and medical malpractice issues. Who ultimately should decide how much money is paid out? I mean, you will have heard some of the jurors here saying, and they were quite frank about it, we haven't a clue. I mean, we were sort of, in effect, sticking our finger in the air and saying, gee, I don't know, 50,000 sounds good, $500,000 sounds good. There are no guidelines. Should there be?
Well, I think that's what part of the controversy here. In the case you reported of a $3 million verdict, there was a not dissimilar case recently in Nevada where a plaintiff received $11 million. So there's a lot of variation in these verdicts that is having a lot of people scratching their heads.
Is there any place in the world we can look to and say, here's a good example of how it's being done right?
Well, I don't know right, but there's certainly other places to look at for examples. Sweden is a country, Finland, Denmark, New Zealand.
What do they do?
Those are countries that do have this structured award schedule that basically says that if you have a certain type of injury or certain level of debilitation, that you would be awarded so much money. And the, I think, advantage is that everybody who falls into that category is treated exactly the same.
Those are, for the most part, small countries that you've talked about. In a gigantic country like the United States, where living, for example, in rural Arkansas is a lot cheaper than living in suburban Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, you can't really have a national standard, can you?
No, I don't think it would be a national standard. I think you'd have to make sure that you're taking into account local conditions, the earnings opportunities of the particular person in question. So there would be variations depending on the specific person and where he or she resided.
What you seem to be saying here is that if indeed someone has been injured, whether it was the doctor's fault or not, that person would receive the same amount from the insurance company.
That's right. Those are some foreign examples. We actually have some domestic examples in Florida and Virginia, where for certain types of neurologically impaired babies, that they move into a no-fault system and are receiving a certain amount of money. So that means that we're not spending a lot of money trying to assign guilt in the system.
And what would you do, for example, with a doctor who is repeatedly being brought to trial for apparent malpractice? Still no fault? I mean, that sounds totally inappropriate.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think that's from the lawyer standpoint and some of the patient advocates standpoint, one of the problems with the system. We need to do a better job of not only improving patient safety and reducing medical errors, but we need to do a better job of policing physicians who are really repeat offenders.
And who should be doing that?
Well,
Other doctors, the medical community as a whole, or the legal community? Now you've got the legal community and we don't like it. So
well,
what's the alternative?
I think the medical community has to do probably a more effective job of policing this, and it could start with the state medical boards.
In all the time that you've been studying this subject, any simple solutions, and we only have a few seconds left, but any simple solutions that I haven't led you to yet?
Well, I think the solution here has got to say that we need to do a better job of fixing the system by reducing medical errors. I mean, that's the basic issue here, is that we can't reform medical malpractice until we reform the practice of medicine. And patient safety and reducing errors has got to be a piece of it. I think that we need to have more focused efforts on developing ways of collecting data on patient errors, understanding where they occur, why they occur, and develop more effective interventions to reduce them.
Mr. Thorpe, I thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
I'll be back in a moment. And now here's what's coming up as ABC's week-long look at healthcare continues. Tomorrow on Good Morning America, a consumer's guide to medical coverage. On World News Tonight, a controversial solution to runaway medical costs, rationing healthcare. And on Nightline tomorrow night, does the U.S. really have the best health care in the world? A major health report says no, not even close. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.